Well, good morning. Welcome to today's webinar, part of the Knowledge Miles series, instituted under the guidance of the 695th Lord Mayor of London. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar, Beware the Techno-Fixes, Draped in Sickly Green, and to welcome Jonathon Porritt, who I'll say a bit more about in just a moment. You probably know me, I'm Mike Wardle. I'm the chair of today's webinar. I'm the Chief Executive Officer at the ZN Group, and delighted to be taking part in this series of webinars. The program today is very simple. A very brief introduction from myself before I give the floor to Sir Jonathon Porritt for his keynote presentation, and then we'll have time for Q&A towards the end of the session. If you haven't used GoToWebinar before, the way to put a question in is to find the question tab on the dashboard, type in your question, that'll come in, and we'll field those towards the end. And you can, of course, put in your questions at any point during the webinar session. Please keep that coming. If something strikes you, you don't have to wait for the Q&A session to make an observation or put your question forward. We will make sure that Jonathon has access to contact details for anyone who asks questions. So if there's any need for any further follow-up or discussion, that can be enabled. The session is being recorded today, so there is the opportunity to go back and re-watch if you've missed something, or indeed to share the recording with friends and colleagues who you think will be interested. And the recording will be posted on our website in a couple of days' time. So all it remains for me to do is to introduce Sir Jonathon Porritt, writer and campaigner, but that hides quite a lot of detail about Jonathon's more than 30-year, I suspect, work, both in advising UK and international companies to deepen their understanding of both climate and biodiversity risk and emergency, but also as president of the Conservation Volunteers, is involved with many other NGOs, co-founded Forum for the Future, formerly co-chair of the Green Party, director of Friends of the Earth, and has spent many years advising governments as well as business in relation to climate and biodiversity change. Jonathon, it's a pleasure to have you with us, and the floor is yours.
Mike, thank you very much indeed, and absolutely delighted to be contributing to this Lord Mayor's lecture series. And what an amazing lineup of lectures you've got for that, I must say, having scanned through it quickly. But I'm going to be talking today about what I think is an increasingly pressing topic, which is how do we distinguish between those technologies which can genuinely and effectively help us and other countries to get to a net zero position, and those technologies which claim that they can do that, but almost certainly won't be able to make a substantive contribution in that regard. That's the thrust to what I'm going to be talking about today. And I guess that the context for this, of course, is the Conference of the Parties that just finished at the end of last year in Dubai. The sort of overall judgments of that event now are pretty clear, from deeply disappointing in the minds of some people to an outright disaster in the judgment of others. Apart from the establishment of a loss and damage fund, which is significant, the breakthrough that was claimed was all about the acknowledgement in the text that it is the fossil fuels that we've been burning for the last few decades that have essentially caused the climate emergency today. Unbelievable that this is the first time that kind of commitment, that understanding has appeared in a consensus document at the end of any of these conferences. That's not exactly a breakthrough, let's be honest. And there was a lot of froth, noise going on all over the place, which actually obscured the real understanding that emerged from COP28 in Dubai, which is that the fossil fuel incumbency, and we are all, of course, in the belly of that particular fossil fuel beast, that incumbency is going to fight hard, ruthlessly, all the way until they will be put out of their misery. It couldn't have been clearer in Dubai. And the gloves-off approach is at least refreshing because we now know precisely where we stand. Unfortunately, the planet doesn't really pay much attention to these human shenanigans, We know from the scientists that any prospects of staying below that average temperature increase of a maximum of 1 degrees centigrade by the end of the century, we know that is now completely unattainable. We will breach the 1.5 degree centigrade threshold. The struggle now is all about what we need to do to stop us exceeding a 2 degree centigrade average increase by the end of the century. That's the battleground now. 1.5 has gone, so we have to address ourselves now to what needs to happen, and we can only do that successfully if we learn from our failures up until now. And one of the things we have to learn is that there are lots of people out there in the fossil fuel incumbency who are playing all sorts of games with different technologies in order to keep themselves in business for as long as possible. And I'm going to focus on just 3 today. CCS, carbon capture and storage. I'm going to look at the whole hydrogen hype and the ways in which hydrogen is both being used and abused as an important part of the race to net zero, if you like. And then I'm going to consider, probably quite briefly, the role of nuclear, which is much in the news at the moment after the announcement on Tuesday that the reactors being built by EDF at Hinkley Point in Somerset are even more of a calamitous disaster than we thought they were going to be. So those are the 3 I just want to touch on, because each of these technologies has the potential to offer up some real substantive contribution to accelerated decarbonisation, or simply to delay what we really need to be doing. I'm not going to be looking at renewables per se. I'm not going to be looking at solar and wind technologies. The reality is that that is already a done deal. We are seeing an astonishing acceleration towards a massive uptick in the percentage of electricity that comes from renewables in general, but particularly from solar and wind. Last year was remarkable. We saw 507 gigawatts of renewable capacity added to grids all around the world. 507, which is 50% more than was the result for 2022. And a lot of that now indicates that we're going to see that kind of growth, 50% increase year on year on year on year, for the foreseeable future. The IEA, the International Energy Agency, which produced its Renewables 2023 report just a couple of weeks ago, and in fact today has just issued its Electricity 2024 analysis. It is indicating that we're going to go from where we are today, which is roughly 30% of all electricity globally coming from renewables today, to somewhere between 42 and 45% of all electricity coming from renewables by 2028. That is the IEA's best bet, if you like, of increased penetration from renewables. And that has huge technological implications, as you can imagine. I could have brought batteries to bear on the discussion today, but that would take too long. But we are going to need to see massive investment in improved and light-weighted batteries if we're going to be able to make this transition really work. So that's the backdrop. We know that renewable will replace fossil fuels. The real question is how quickly. And that's where CCS becomes such an important question, carbon capture and storage. This is not a new technology. 35 years ago, the first CCS plant was actually developed in the USA, and we have seen a succession of investments of one kind or another in different variations of CCS since that point. They've not been a huge success. Most of the successful plants have been done on the basis, or funded on the basis, that the carbon they capture will then be used for what is called enhanced oil recovery, which provides a financial value for each ton of CO2 sequestered, captured, and then reused for enhanced oil recovery. Most of the plants, if not all, have failed to meet the promised capture rates. So the percentage of the CO2 gases in the flue flues of these power stations or other bits of kit which they've been attached to. Most of them have never matched the promised capture rates, and many have not got above 50 to 60% of the CO2 in the flue gases properly captured and dealt with. So CCS all comes down to capture rates, cost, because they're not cheap to install, and energy conversion. How much additional energy is needed to power the CCS plant on whatever it is, whether it's a thermal power station or a cement installation or chemicals installation, whatever it might be. So we can't rule out CCS completely, because there will be uses of CCS which will be very important in the hard to abate sector. And I just mentioned the chemicals and cement, which I think will be two of the most important. The real horror story is the suggestion that you could continue to burn coal, thermal coal, or gas in conventional power stations with CCS added on to those thermal units. That is not a good outcome for the planet. It is very expensive. It almost certainly won't be able to capture as much of the CO2 as we need, and it will delay getting out of those fossil fuels into the renewables plus that we really need. Now, whenever I talk about renewables, I'm actually talking about renewables plus efficiency plus storage plus grid upgrades. It comes as an integrated package, which has a significant implication, of course, for different technologies. So people who say that CCS is going to be brilliant, and there were many of those at COP28 in Dubai. There were more than 2,000 delegates, as you know, from the oil and gas industries, and they're all preaching the upside of CCS. Many who say that that's what we need now, is a huge new rollout of investments in CCS on thermal generators. That is a classic example of what is called predatory delay. The fossil fuel incumbency using a technology to prolong the lifetime of their existing assets, particularly their gas assets for the future. There's one particular variation of this that is very important at the moment, and that relates to the manufacture of hydrogen, my second main area today. Now, hydrogen is often touted as a clean and green technology for the future. In and of itself, hydrogen is a very dirty source of raw material for use in our industrialized economy. The emissions from manufacture of hydrogen today in the global economy are roughly the equivalent, slightly less than, about 60 million tons less than, the total emissions from the aviation sector. So we all know how concerned people are about emissions from the aviation sector, usually calculated at somewhere between 2 and 2.5% of total global emissions before you count the emissions from other gases apart from CO2. And the manufacture of hydrogen has a very similar level of global emissions from its conventional manufacture today. That's mostly gas, some coal, and a tiny bit of what is called green hydrogen at the moment. So hydrogen at the moment is a very dirty fuel. It's not really a fuel, it's an energy carrier, but it's a very dirty business. And the first thing that the hydrogen industry has to do is to clean up its own act. It doesn't have anything to offer the future unless it can rapidly achieve its own decarbonization story. One of the main ways of doing that, we are told, is by manufacturing blue hydrogen. And blue hydrogen is conventional hydrogen, steam methane reforming hydrogen with CCS added on. And again, this is a form of predatory delay. We don't want to put these massive new investments in blue hydrogen. What we really need to do is to press as fast as we possibly can for green hydrogen. And you will have been hearing a lot about green hydrogen over the last 5 years, really. The promise of green hydrogen is out there, much touted as a massive breakthrough technology for all sorts of different purposes, but particularly in the hard to abate sectors, whether that's green steel, for instance, using green hydrogen, or some of the other hard to abate sectors, including aviation, which I'll come on to in a moment. So the hydrogen hype has to be deconstructed. Much of the hydrogen hype is mendacious and deliberately distorted by fossil fuel industries to spin out their own asset life. But green hydrogen is absolutely critical to the scale transition that we are now talking about, those hard to abate sectors. Of course, green hydrogen depends on one technology in particular, apart from the renewable electricity that it needs to use, and that's the technology of electrolyzers. And one of the most encouraging bits of data that I've seen in the last 3 months has been the degree to which investment in electrolyzer optimization is already beginning to achieve significant cost reductions and significant efficiency improvements. That's the cost and efficiency curves that we saw with solar, with onshore, offshore wind, battery technology, and so on. It's now happening with electrolyzers, which is enormously important because green hydrogen at the moment is significantly more expensive, much more expensive than blue hydrogen, let alone grey or brown hydrogen. So that's a big technology story unfolding now, and the expectations of the electrolyzer industry are very high, very ambitious, because they know that the promise of green hydrogen depends almost entirely on being able to crack that technological issue. The big prize of all with the hydrogen hype is the idea that we might be able to use green hydrogen for decarbonizing aviation. When we talk about hard to abate sectors, there are many hard to abate sectors, but none is harder than aviation. And there are three routes, essentially. One is an approach using battery electric planes or hybrid battery electric planes, which also use conventional kerosene. The other is sustainable aviation fuel, SAF, substituting for kerosene, a drop-in like-for-like equivalent. And the third, much bruited by Airbus in particular, is converting planes to hydrogen. 5 years ago, I suspect most people dismissed most of that as another aspect of hydrogen hype, that there wasn't likely to be any scaled improvement in the use of hydrogen. But it has to be said, and I really welcome this, that in the last 3 years in particular, the investments made by some of the really big players in this space now do indicate that we could see a more rapid emergence of hydrogen-powered aviation than once seemed to be the case. So one of the biggest initiatives in this area recently has been the emergence of the Hydrogen in Aviation Alliance, a brand new alliance of big players in the industry, a lot of it driven by Airbus and by Rolls-Royce, but other players, including Ørsted, which has a big interest in using green electricity to manufacture the green hydrogen, EasyJet's involved in this. So it's a big consortium, powerful consortium. And they're looking at both ways in which hydrogen might become relevant to aviation. One is the hydrogen electric way of doing it, propulsion systems using fuel cells. And the other is direct combustion of hydrogen as an alternative to burning kerosene. Often seen as a bit of a dodgy enterprise because of some of the dangers associated with carrying large amounts of hydrogen under pressure. But actually that safety issue is, as far as the engineers are concerned, much more manageable. The difficulty they have is that you need roughly 3 to 4 times as much hydrogen as you do kerosene to fly a plane the same distance. And that's a massive challenge, which is why more people are doubling down on the combination through fuel cells of hydrogen electric propulsion systems. Some real breakthrough companies here, fascinating pioneering companies. Zero Avia is the one that is probably best known, has already had its 26-seater plane in many trial flights over the course of the last year. It's now pushing on to developing a 76-seater plane, which it hopes to have up in the air at some point before the end of 2024, which would be extraordinary. And there's a lot of excitement about this, some of it overexcitement, in my opinion. Usual McKinsey's rubbish. As you know, McKinsey always goes to the outer extreme of what is or isn't possible technology-wise, and is always wrong. But to be fair, McKinsey's have said that if governments wanted to work with the private sector to push this really hard, then the market could open up through the 2030s in such a way that it might be, hydrogen-driven aviation might be providing 30% of total aviation demand by 2050. That's the most optimistic, outrageous claim that is made, maybe 30% substitution for kerosene for aviation by 2050. So we should be welcoming that, to be honest, because it could be a really very significant part of the total technology mix. And that brings me to my last sector, which is nuclear. Now, this is difficult because an awful lot of people have come to the conclusion over the course of the last few years that you can't do net zero without nuclear. All sorts of reasons why they've come to that conclusion. Some of them shared publicly and others behind the scene, particularly the link to nuclear weapons rather than to nuclear power. But a lot of people are persuaded that we just can't do the net zero story without nuclear. Reality is beginning to shock some of those people into a very different state these days. You will have seen the announcements from EDF on Tuesday regarding its flagship project here in the UK at Hinkley Point in Somerset, with the price tag now rising from around 24 to nearer to 32 billion pounds in 2015 prices, which today translates into 46 billion pounds. And a further delay for the point at which Hinkley C will actually be putting any electrons, low carbon electrons, into the grid. Earliest possible date now 2029. All neutral, dispassionate commentators have come to the conclusion that there will be further delays and further costs, meaning no electricity from Hinkley until 2031 at an astonishing cost of more than 50 billion pounds. It's practically unbelievable the ways in which this has made such an impact on policymakers and politicians' views of the future. And then they want to do the same at Sizewell C, another 50 billion pound turkey. So, of course, the industry has said, okay, we can see that big nuclear has probably come to the end of the road, so now we're going to get going on promoting small modular reactors as the alternative to big nuclear, as a really important part of the whole net zero mix. And the hype around SMRs, small modular reactors, over the last 2 to 3 years has been absolutely astonishing. Absolutely astonishing. Because there's literally nothing out there at the moment. There are lots of small reactors out there at the moment, but not modular. And modular means that components are being constructed in a factory setting so that the actual construction period for the reactor itself can be significantly reduced in both times, in time and in terms of costs. The little reactors that have been built have largely come to nothing. So in both the USA, in India, in Germany, in Japan, in France, there have been lots of small reactors built. Almost all of them now, apart from the Indian small reactors, have closed down. And they've closed down because they're just too expensive. You don't get the amount of electricity you need for the costs of running small reactors at that level. And that's the trade-off. People went to big reactors because of economies of scale. As soon as you're doing small reactors, you're back down to almost impossible cost penalties. Far too little electricity for far too much capex. So the situation now is very clear. Most of the front runners in this area, NuScale and M Generation, M Power in the USA, most of those companies are now on the back foot. NuScale recently had to cancel a huge contract in Idaho in the USA because it just couldn't get to the right cost point for consumers and regulators in that very important deal. NewScale has pulled right back now, and many people think the NewScale will cease to exist in the course of the next 6 months. Lots of other companies you may hear about. Bill Gates is endlessly promoting TerraPower and various other things. X-Energy. Oklo is another one that's talked about. Rolls-Royce, of course, now is in the field, demanding that the UK government should give preference to a UK-based innovator of that kind. But there is no approved design for an SMR anywhere in the world at the moment. So why do we go on and on and on sticking with these nuclear obsessions? It's a very interesting question for me indeed. So that's the sort of sweep that I'm hoping will distinguish between those technologies which will make a genuine contribution to our incredibly ambitious net zero trajectories, and they are in all countries. Getting to net zero by 2050 is genuinely ambitious. Don't dismiss that as a bit of greenwash. It's a hugely complex challenge for countries all around the world to achieve. But as you look at that challenge, which technologies are genuinely going to help push us down that path towards those net zero targets, and which aren't? And you might say, in conclusion, you might say, well, does it really matter? We've always had winners and losers in every technology-driven transition. There are always some that come out on top and some that don't make it. And billions of dollars of potential investment is burnt one way or the other. And there are some winners and there are many, many losers. So what's different right now? Well, there are two things that are different. The first is what I've mentioned, that any delay in this area now is fantastically problematic from the point of view of staying below a temperature threshold of 2 degrees centigrade. Delay is the new denial, as is often said by climate scientists. And secondly, the opportunity costs of going down these false technology paths is huge. If we could just double down on renewables, efficiency, storage, and grids, and make that the focus of the transition, we'd find ourselves in a very much stronger position than we're in today. So I'll finish there, if that's all right. I hope that's stirred one or two ideas about discussion we might have on each of those different points. But thank you. Thanks, Mike.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathon. Thank you indeed. We've got a number of questions already in, and as I say, if you do have questions or observations, please do use the dashboard on the screen to put them in. But Ian Roderick, first of all, has just asked whether you could at least touch on geoengineering and the possibility. Does that come within renewables in your mind, or where does geoengineering fit?
Yeah, Yep, time constraints and all that. I couldn't really cover that, but geoengineering is in itself another massive controversial terrain of new technological opportunity, some of which will really make a difference and some of which will probably be very problematic in itself. The reality is we are going to need a lot of geoengineering. There's not any single scenario for net zero by 2050 that doesn't include bringing back down out of the atmosphere gigatons of CO2. Gigatons, billions of tons. So we're going to be geoengineering that bit of the atmosphere and the terrestrial and marine environments as we seek to find ways of doing that safely and cost effectively. So it's going to happen, and NGOs hate that. They just can't bear the thought that we've messed up so badly and continue to mess up in terms of the 40.
Thank you very much.
2 billion tons of CO2 that go into the atmosphere every year. They can't bear the prospect of geoengineering, but it is going to happen, and there will be some seriously good technological responses there, and there will be many that are seriously problematic.
Thank you so much. Matthew Leach has asked you to comment on the cost of adapting to climate change in comparison with the economic impact of cutting fossil fuel use. And he says he doesn't assume that's a net cost, by the way, cutting fossil fuel use. But where does the cost benefit sort of sit between adaptation and the impact of cutting fossil fuel use?
It slightly depends what time frame you want to make that financial comparison. If you want to do it in the short frame, which we have now through to 2030, then adaptation costs will be high. If you pitch it out to 2050, where we've got a chance to make the investment still in a managed and cost-effective way, then it looks very different. And if you do what Nick Stern has done in his recent report, so going back to the Stern report on the economics of climate change, he pushes out to 2100. And then, of course, the figures look very different. So the cost factor first, we've just had a new report published earlier in the week showing that 2023 saw $830 billion worth of damage through natural and climate-induced disasters. And that is a rising figure, as you know. We're already heading well into figures closer to $1 trillion every year. And the insurance industry is now saying, this isn't going to work. We're not going to be able to provide conventional cover for assets of any kind, including the whole housing sector, if we cannot address now these increased climate-related costs. So the adaptation investments that are needed are in themselves a form of insurance. They are investments to ward off some of the massive costs that will otherwise be incurred as we go through the 1.5 degree threshold and see worsening climate impacts year on year on year, unless we can stabilize those emissions and gradually bring concentrations of CO2 and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere back down to something which would give us much greater safety.
Thank you very much. Joel Hamilton wants to move on to electrolyzers, and just asking, in your view, how close are we to the physical limits of electrolyzer improvement in terms of their efficiency? His understanding is that physics will always result in green hydrogen being relatively expensive from an energy perspective, but how close are we to the physical limits of the technology, do you think?
I don't know. And I'm not being an engineer or a scientist myself, I'm always a little bit nervous about the more optimistic projections that I hear and would like to see a bit more skepticism about what is or isn't possible. We know that with all of these technologies, whether you're talking about solar cells, for instance, or battery technology or electrolyzers, that there are upper limits to what can be achieved through any of these technologies, and we need to be mindful of that. But as I understand it, looking at the latest literature about improvements in electrolyzer manufacture, they haven't reached the upper limit as yet. But there will be an upper limit, and it will still mean that green hydrogen is going to be expensive. Any idea that we're going to get down to sort of unit cost of green hydrogen is almost too cheap to worry about, that's just mad. It's always going to be expensive, and we're going to have to use it very sparingly for the purposes that matter most. Which is why, of course, people are so excited about aviation, because they think there will always be demand for aviation products. Inelasticities in that sector are very significant. So we're always going to have to be mindful about the choices we make about uses of green hydrogen. So injecting green hydrogen into gas grids, for instance, is the closest thing to insanity that you can imagine. And the government, fortunately, has now dropped that fantasy that it once had.
Whereas it might make a contribution in shipping, for example, or in some other areas. Yeah, understood.
Indeed.
Clive Bullins asked your view about what the UK should be prioritising, and how do climate actions cope with the fact of increasing populations and wealth, and hence higher energy demand over time.
I think one of the things that the UK has got badly wrong is ignoring the efficiency story. Very strong messages coming out of COP28 in Dubai. There wasn't just a call for tripling renewable capacity, there was a call for doubling the overall investment in energy efficiency, both in industry and in the built environment. And we are really bad at that. We've had a succession of governments that have just completely messed up the retrofit story and setting sufficiently tough standards for new build, both in residential and in non-residential sectors. So for the UK, thinking about the story about fair transitions and social justice in the UK, going after retrofit for our entire built environment is probably for me the most important area of all. It's the one area where a combination of government support and private sector investment would make a massive difference to the lives of some of the poorest people in the UK. We have a terrible record on dealing with fuel poverty. So I'd like to bring that forward on the sort of fair transition, just transition story. And I think you would get many, many more people understanding that the move away from fossil fuels need not worsen cost of living issues, but may actually significantly improve health and economic outcomes for hundreds of thousands of people in the UK, millions of people in the UK.
Thank you so much. A question from Mike Clark asking, how do we encourage the global insurance industry to make it even clearer to governments that they're going to leave the stage with increasing speed, which is going to be bad for the whole economic system and capitalism as a whole. But certainly if you, and I do speak to insurers looking at the big picture, just saying that increasingly risk is uninsurable in various ways.
Yeah.
But how do we encourage the insurance industry to be speaking much more loudly on this?
Yeah. This is a bit of a mystery, I have to say, because the reinsurance sector, the big reinsurance companies, were onto this at least 10, if not 15 years ago. And we're beginning to flag some of the implications of a growing number of climate-induced disasters and the impact that would have on the insurance sector all that time ago. I think what happened is that a lot of the insurance companies themselves got used to being able to respond incrementally. So there would be damage caused by climate impacts, but they would be able to fix their premiums to ensure that people were paying more, and the gap between what they had to pay out and what people were prepared to pay in wasn't, let's say it wasn't unmanageable. They thought they could handle increased climate damage through tweaking the existing insurance model, costing risk more effectively and staying on top of that. In the last couple of years, particularly in the USA, that's just totally disappeared. So in states like California, Florida, Louisiana, South Carolina, what you see now is huge impacts on the resilience of the insurance industry itself. Many more people shifting into insurer of last resort relationships with state-based insurance companies. And you've seen a lot of the big national insurance providers pull out completely from some of these markets, particularly in California, where 4 of the largest insurance providers in the USA have now said we're not prepared to take on any new residential business in California. So for me, that puts the onus back on the reinsurance companies, because they're the ones who have to insure the insurance companies. And I suspect now that we'll see a surge of growing pressure from the global insurance industry to say this is not a viable business model for the sector as a whole. And I think they'll move much faster than the other 2 legs of the global capital markets, both banking and investment.
Thank you very much. And that moves on to a question from Deborah Webster, who's suggesting there's a lot of dumb money or delusional capital in this space. I'm wondering whether there's a resource we could create for investors to run a sound check on technologies and solutions that they're considering backing. How do investors know what is a good bet and what is barking up the wrong tree?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Is there a kind of generic due diligence intervention which would help investors understand the nature of the risks and benefits that were on offer? I don't know the answer to that, Deborah. I mean, for me, it's always seemed astonishing, for instance, with nuclear, that we continue to see these investments, I mean, billions and billions of dollars of both government and private sector money going into technologies that can't possibly do the job. NuScale, I mentioned the small modular reactor company in the USA. If you look at all the subsidies that it was promised by government, it was somewhere between $3 and $4 billion of subsidy, both real subsidy to get through to the licensing stage and then price support. reduce prices to make the technology more viable. That's a massive investment in a technology that was probably never going to see the light of day. And there were a lot of private sector investors who've been very badly burned within the SMR world already. So I don't know how one could proof those markets so that investors had a better sense of what was or wasn't likely to emerge as winners. But wow, it would be very helpful. We're going to see billions of dollars just burned through really stupid investments being made. I don't relish that prospect, because those billions could be going elsewhere with far better, safer returns for investors than going into these very speculative predatory delay technologies.
It leads on to a couple of comments we've got on nuclear. Oliver Rothschild just said the cost of nuclear has gone beyond what is a reasonable scale. And what's your views about the application of the investment and cost to refining solutions that are already being used? And I suspect that putting the same investment in renewables would have reached a different outcome. Joel Hamilton has, however, asked particularly what your view is on the scalability of small nuclear reactor for heat and power production. There is this view that one can decarbonize heat in urban areas if you can get small nuclear reactors accepted near urban centres and with thorium salts and other suggestions. But where's your view on that at the moment?
It's a huge challenge to kind of keep all of these different perspectives in proportion, because the cost factor for big nuclear is now, as we've seen with EDF, but it's the same globally, has gone off any known scale of sort of viability. And were it not for the fact that these are government businesses, EDF is 100% owned now by the French government, and CGN, the big Chinese nuclear company, is 100% owned by the Chinese government. Were it not for those underpinning state guarantees, I think nuclear would be, as a civil technology, would be dead, because the opportunity cost now of ploughing all of that stuff into long-term nuclear white elephants those opportunity costs are huge. In terms of other ways of using nuclear power, and there are other suggestions, for instance, that a small reactor designed and built specifically to produce green hydrogen with a different balance between electricity output and heat output would be a real breakthrough for the green hydrogen sector. I'm open to anybody thinking that there may be some additional breakthroughs still to be had here, but they've all got to go through the same processes. They've got to come forward with designs. They've got to have those designs tested. They've got to achieve proper levels of certification. It's a long, drawn-out process with many, many cost factors brought in. And the likelihood of those being cheaper than doing it by other means, I think, is very low indeed. But we don't have those designs on the table at the moment. They may come, they'll be tested, and then we'll see whether that's value for money, which I strongly doubt, I have to say.
Thank you very much. We're almost running out of time, but time for some very quick comments and a couple of questions, if that's all right. First of all, Matthew Leach has asked the question about carbon capture and storage, but without any subsidy. In other words, if you could do carbon capture and storage as part of the process of fossil fuel extraction, would that be okay? I guess, even though it would make obviously the product much more expensive.
Yes, I think we will see, as I said, we will see carbon capture and storage used with varying degrees of subsidy in different sectors. So I'm theoretically in favor of the right uses of carbon capture, especially if the geological sequestration end of it, so the storage end of it, can be guaranteed through really effective regulation and insurance regimes and so on and so forth. So I'm in favor of that. Could we do it without subsidy? Very tricky at the moment, because there just isn't the operating record to do that. And we will see significant public money going into this suite of technologies for quite some time, I expect.
Thank you very much. And very quickly, Ian Hillier-Brook has just asked your opinion of the German government's decision to close down their nuclear power stations. He describes that as a stupid decision. But where do you think it leaves Western Europe, I guess, with those kind of decisions being taken?
Well, I quite agree with you. And when Germany decided to do that after Fukushima, I was the first to say premature closure of really well managed, properly regulated, very high performing nuclear assets is mad because there's nothing to be gained from it. And that was the case in Germany. That's got nothing to do with new build. But once you put all of that effort and you sunk all that capital into assets of that kind, you need to squeeze out those low carbon electrons for as long as you safely can.
Well, thank you very much. I'm afraid time has beaten us, but a fascinating session, and we've got comments in the questions just saying thank you, which is great. As I've mentioned, the recording will be up in a couple of days' time, so do look out for that. Just a brief word about things that are coming up next Tuesday. What does quantum computing mean for cybersecurity? Initiating sustainability and success in SMEs on Thursday, and a week on Monday, a tale of two carbon markets. So back to carbon and sustainability. Just remains for me to thank you for your attendance, for your questions, for your engagement. It's been a fascinating session, but mostly to thank Jonathon for his time and his clear exposition of the state that he currently sees in the development of technology. Jonathon, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much, and we'll see you all again very soon. Thank you.
Thanks so much.